You planning on tearing the whole neighborhood apart with that thing?" I looked up from the weed trimmer and saw this guy standing at the edge of the driveway with his arms folded tight across his chest like he'd been waiting all morning for a reason to start something. Before I could even answer, he pointed toward the side of the old brick house behind me and said, "You got no business over there." And honestly, if I hadn't met the man living inside that house maybe 20 minutes earlier, I probably would have packed my equipment up and left right then. But there was something about the whole situation that didn't sit right with me from the start. The house belonged to an 86-year-old retired mail carrier named Walter Grayson, and the second I saw the condition of that side yard, I understood immediately why he'd stopped trying to handle it himself. The grass wasn't just overgrown, it looked abandoned. Thick patches of brittle yellow weeds twisted together with waist-high grass that leaned over the narrow walkway like it was trying to swallow it whole. You couldn't even see the ground underneath anymore. Broken concrete, exposed roots, loose gravel, all hidden beneath layers of dry growth, just waiting for somebody to lose their footing. And for Walter, one bad fall would have probably been the end of him living alone. I remember walking up to his front porch earlier that morning because I'd noticed the yard while finishing a cleanup job a few blocks away. The mailbox was hanging crooked, the gutters were clogged with dead leaves, and there was this silence around the property that felt heavy somehow, like the kind of quiet house people stop noticing after they've been alone too long. I knocked twice before the door finally opened. Walter stood there wearing an old blue cardigan even though it was warm outside, one hand resting against the doorframe while the other trembled slightly at his side. He gave me this polite little smile people from that generation always seem to have, even when life's beating the hell out of them. "Can I help you?" he asked. I told him I worked nearby and noticed the side yard looked dangerous. Asked if he wanted a hand clearing it out. For a second, he didn't answer. He just looked past me toward the side of the house like he was embarrassed I'd even seen it. Then he let out this dry little laugh and said, "Used to take me 2 hours to cut the whole property. Now I can barely make it down the porch steps without sounding like an old tractor." That line stuck with me. Not because it was funny, though it kinda was, but because you could hear the frustration underneath it. Walter told me he'd worked 38 years delivering mail across that town. Rain, snow, heat waves, never missed a route. But about 8 months earlier, he slipped while trying to clear the weeds near the side steps after a storm rolled through. Fell hard onto the concrete. Laid there almost 40 minutes before he could drag himself up using the railing. After that, he stopped going over there altogether. "Truth is," he admitted quietly, "I started pretending that side of the house didn't exist." And man, hearing somebody say that about their own home hit harder than I expected. So I told him not to worry about it, that I'd clear the whole thing out for free. At first he refused, the way older folks sometimes do when pride's the only thing they still feel they own completely. But eventually he nodded and stepped aside. "Well," he said, "if you're stubborn enough to do it in this heat, I'm stubborn enough not to argue." So I got to work. The trimmer line kept snapping against thick, dry stalks, sending dust and bits of dead grass into the air while the sound echoed off the brick wall beside me. Slowly the ground started reappearing, cracked stepping stones, a rusted flower bed border, even an old garden hose buried underneath the weeds like some forgotten fossil. And every few minutes I'd glance back toward the porch and catch Walter watching through the screen door, arms folded quietly, almost like he couldn't believe somebody actually showed up. Then about 30 minutes in, that other guy appeared. Tall, heavy-set, gray ball cap, mirrored sunglasses, walking across the neighboring driveway with the kind of attitude that instantly changes the temperature around you. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't ask how Walter was doing. He just stared at the equipment, then at the cleared strip beside the house, and said, "You know, Walter didn't ask permission from the association for this, right?" That was the moment I realized this wasn't really about the noise. And whatever history existed between those two houses, I just stepped directly into the middle of it. I shut the trimmer off and just looked at the guy for a second because honestly, the first thing that crossed my mind was, association? This neighborhood barely even looked organized enough to have functioning streetlights, let alone some powerful homeowners association running around measuring grass height. But the guy stood there like he owned the entire block. "Walter's property line runs closer than you think," he said, tapping the side of his sunglasses with one finger. "And technically, anything past that drainage strip becomes community access." Community access. The way he said it made me want to laugh. Like the patch of dead weeds beside an 86-year-old man's house was some sacred piece of real estate. I wiped sweat off my forehead and said, "I'm just clearing a walkway so the old man doesn't break his neck." The guy smirked. Not amused, more like irritated somebody wasn't intimidated yet. "Yeah," he said. "Well, maybe you should ask why nobody else around here touches this place anymore." Then he turned and walked back toward his driveway without another word. That should have been the end of it. Probably would have been in a normal neighborhood. But the second he disappeared around the fence line, Walter slowly opened the screen door behind me and said, almost under his breath, "That'd be Dennis Mercer." The way he said the name told me everything before he explained a single detail. You ever hear somebody say a name like it already comes with 20 years of exhaustion attached to it? That's what this felt like. Walter stepped carefully down onto the porch, moving slower than before, and lowered himself into an old rusted lawn chair near the front steps. "Dennis wasn't always like this," he said. "Used to help people around here once upon a time." Then he paused a second and added, "At least when there was something in it for him." Turns out Dennis had lived next door almost 15 years. Former contractor. Loud personality. The kind of guy who inserted himself into everybody's business until eventually nobody could tell where his property ended and theirs began. According to Walter, things really changed after Walter's wife Eleanor passed away 3 years earlier. That hit me harder than I expected because suddenly the whole property made sense. The neglected flower beds, the sagging wind chimes, the empty hanging baskets still hooked under the porch roof. You could feel where another person used to exist there. Walter pointed toward a dead patch near the driveway and said, "That used to be her roses." And for a second his voice almost disappeared completely. After Eleanor died, Dennis started offering to help more often. At first it sounded neighborly. He'd pressure Walter about repairs, complain the property brought home values down, insist he needed assistance managing things. But eventually the offer started sounding more like control. Dennis convinced Walter to sign paperwork allowing temporary access through the side yard during some drainage project for the neighborhood. Temporary somehow became permanent in Dennis's mind. Over time he started treating that strip beside the house like it belonged to him. Parking trailers there. Stacking lumber near Walter's fence. Even telling neighbors Walter couldn't maintain the property anymore. "Truth is," Walter said quietly, staring toward the weeds I'd already cut down, "I think he expected me to either move away or die." That sentence just sat there between us in the heat. No drama, no anger, just an old man saying something he'd had too much time to think about alone. And suddenly Dennis coming over angry about me trimming grass made a whole lot more sense. Because if the property started looking cared for again, people might stop seeing Walter as helpless. I picked the trimmer back up and kept working. But now every pass through the grass felt different. It wasn't just yard work anymore. It felt like peeling back evidence of how isolated this guy had become. The deeper I got into the overgrowth, the more signs I found that the place used to matter to somebody. There were old solar lights buried under weeds, decorative stones around flower beds, a faded little wooden sign that read Eleanor's garden half covered in dirt. At one point, I uncovered a narrow brick pathway leading toward the backyard, and Walter actually laughed softly from the porch. "Forgot that thing was even there," he said. That laugh lasted maybe 2 seconds, but man, hearing it felt like proof the house was waking back up. Around noon, I took a water break, and Walter invited me inside for lemonade. The house looked exactly how lonely feels. Clean enough, but frozen in time. Family photos everywhere. Old clocks ticking too loudly. One recliner positioned perfectly toward a television that probably stayed on more for company than entertainment. Walter handed me a glass and pointed toward a framed photograph on the shelf. Him in a postal uniform beside Eleanor at some Christmas parade years ago. "She used to make me trim the lawn twice a week," he said with a grin. "Claimed the neighbors judged my mowing patterns." I laughed and said, "Honestly, she probably wasn't wrong." And for the first time all morning, Walter genuinely smiled. But right as we started talking easier, we heard the sound of tires outside. Dennis again. Only this time he wasn't alone. I stepped toward the front window and saw a white county pickup parked near the curb. Dennis stood beside it talking to a code enforcement officer while pointing directly toward Walter's property. I remember muttering, "You gotta be kidding me." Walter didn't even look surprised. That was the worst part. He just stared down into his lemonade and sighed like this exact scene had played out before. Dennis likes rules when they help Dennis, he said quietly. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The officer introduced himself politely enough, said they'd received a complaint about unauthorized landscaping work and possible encroachment near the drainage easement. I could already feel my blood pressure climbing. Dennis stood several feet behind him with his arms crossed, and this smug little expression, like a guy watching somebody else get thrown out of a game, he rigged himself. The officer asked who hired me. Before I could answer, Walter slowly stepped forward, and I swear something changed in him right there. Maybe it was embarrassment finally turning into anger. Maybe it was just exhaustion reaching its limit. But his voice came out stronger this time. I hired him, he said, on my property, to clear my walkway so I don't fall and crack my skull open. The officer glanced back toward Dennis, who immediately jumped in talking fast about property lines, safety violations, neighborhood complaints. But the more Dennis talked, the worse he sounded. Like a man trying too hard to justify why an old neighbor cutting his own grass somehow threatened the community. Finally, the officer held up one hand and said, "Sir, from what I can see, he's removing hazardous overgrowth, not building a shopping mall." I nearly laughed out loud. Dennis sure didn't. His whole face tightened instantly. But then the officer added something that changed the entire mood. He looked at Walter and asked quietly, "Have you had trouble accessing parts of your property safely?" Walter hesitated, and in that pause alone, you could hear years of pride fighting with reality. Then he nodded once, more than I like admitting. The officer looked around the yard again, then toward Dennis's stacked equipment partially crossing the side easement. Trailer wheels, lumber piles, rusted piping, stuff that definitely didn't belong there either. Suddenly Dennis wasn't smirking anymore, and for the first time since I met him, he looked nervous. The craziest part is Dennis must have realized it too, because his whole attitude changed almost instantly. A minute earlier he'd been standing there like some self-appointed king of the neighborhood, chest puffed out, acting like Walter trimming his own property was a federal offense. But now the county officer was staring directly at the pile of construction junk spilling halfway across the easement, and suddenly Dennis couldn't stop adjusting his hat and clearing his throat. "Well," he muttered, "that equipment's only there temporarily." The officer raised an eyebrow. "According to these tire tracks," he said, "temporarily's been a pretty long time." I had to bite the inside of my cheek not to grin. Walter didn't say a word. He just stood there beside the doorway, shoulders slightly straighter than before, watching the whole thing unfold like somebody finally turned the lights on in a room he'd been trapped inside for years. The officer walked the side yard slowly, taking photos on a small tablet, while Dennis followed behind, trying to explain every little thing away. But the more he talked, the deeper he dug himself. At one point, he actually gestured toward Walter and said, "Look, the man can barely maintain the place anymore. Somebody has to think about property values." And man, the silence after that sentence hit hard, because even Dennis realized too late how ugly it sounded out loud. Walter looked down at the porch boards for a second, not angry exactly, just tired in a way I don't think words can fully describe. Then he said something so calm it cut deeper than yelling ever could. "My wife and I paid for this home 52 years ago," he said. "Back when there was nothing here but dirt roads and orange trees. I raised 2 kids in this house, worked every winter storm this county ever had, buried my wife from this address, and somehow you started talking about me like I was already gone." Nobody moved after that. Even the officer kind of froze for a second. Dennis opened his mouth like he wanted to fire back, but nothing came out. Because what do you even say to that? That moment changed everything. Not dramatically like some Hollywood movie where the villain suddenly apologizes and everybody hugs in slow motion. Real life's messier than that. Dennis just looked away, embarrassed more than remorseful. The officer finished documenting the easement violations and told Dennis he'd need to clear the obstruction within 30 days or face fines from the county. Then he turned to Walter and said something softer. "Sir, for what it's worth, this cleanup probably prevented a bad accident." After the truck pulled away, the whole neighborhood got strangely quiet again. Dennis disappeared into his garage without another word, and Walter just stood there staring at the cleared pathway running beside his house like he was seeing part of his own life return to him piece by piece. I figured that was probably the end of my day. Finish trimming, pack up, head home. But right as I started loading equipment back onto my trailer, Walter walked carefully down the newly cleared path by himself for the first time. Slow steps, one hand brushing lightly against the brick wall. But he did it. No stumbling, no fear. When he reached the back gate, he turned around smiling like a little kid who'd just gotten away with something. "Well, I'll be damned," he laughed. "I forgot how wide this yard actually is." That right there, that was the moment that stuck with me most. Not the argument, not Dennis getting humbled. Just an old man rediscovering part of his home he'd mentally surrendered months earlier. Before I left, Walter insisted on giving me something for helping. I told him no at least 4 times. Eventually, he disappeared inside and came back holding an old photograph. Black and white. Him and Eleanor standing beside a freshly planted rose garden sometime in the early 70s. "Take this," he said. "Proof this place looked respectable once." I laughed and told him the place still had good bones. Then he pointed toward the side yard and said, "Maybe now I'll stop pretending half my house doesn't exist." I drove away thinking that'd be the last time I saw him. But about 3 weeks later, I came back through the neighborhood for another job and nearly missed the house entirely because it looked so different. The grass was maintained. The porch had fresh flowers. Somebody repaired the mailbox. And hanging beside the front steps was a small wooden sign painted bright blue that read Eleanor's Garden Again. Walter was sitting outside drinking iced tea when he spotted my truck. He waved me over smiling. Then he nodded toward Dennis's property and said, almost whispering like gossip between old friends, "County made him move every last piece of junk." I laughed harder than I probably should have. But then Walter added something else. Funny thing is, after all that happened, Dennis actually came over 2 days ago and asked if I needed help fixing the fence. I stared at him. "Seriously?" Walter nodded slowly. Told him I'd think about it. That answer cracked me up because honestly, after everything, maybe that was the most power Walter had felt in years. And look, I still don't know whether Dennis was truly trying to help at the end or just trying to save face after the county embarrassed him. Maybe people only change when consequences finally corner them. Maybe loneliness makes neighbors territorial in ways we don't fully understand. Or maybe some folks get so used to seeing older people fade quietly into the background that they stop viewing them as people altogether. I don't know. But I do know this. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for somebody isn't fixing their property. It's reminding them they still deserve to fully live in their own life. Anyway, I'm curious what you think. Was Dennis genuinely concerned about the neighborhood, or was he trying to push Walter out slowly over time? And if you were in Walter's position, would you ever trust Dennis again after all that? Let me know down in the comments, because I've seen people completely split over this story. And if you enjoy real stories like this about neighbors, conflict, and the small moments that end up meaning way more than anybody expected, hit subscribe, because I've got another one coming soon.